Hello and welcome back to the Joyful Soul Creates. Charlotte here, and today I have a no line colouring Valentine's card to share with you, and this is part of a blog hop that's going on at the moment. All the details for that will be in the description box below if you would like to check that out. There are some prizes along the hop, so definitely take a look if you'd like to win those. For my card I am using the Monster Mash stamp set from Lawn Fawn. This doesn't necessarily come as an obvious choice for a Valentine's card, it's more of a Halloween-y feel to it, but I thought it would be fun to use for this card. I started by stamping one of the monsters onto a die cut heart using Spun Sugar Distress ink. This heart is cut from Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and then I've also stamped it onto a piece of masking tape so I can mask off my little monster as well. I also masked off the bottom portion of the heart with the same kind of masking tape, and that will create my ground area. And then I'm using the My Favorite Things mini cloud stencil to create clouds in the background of my heart because I am creating a little scene. And again, I'm using the Spun Sugar Distress ink and just working from the horizon line up the heart, changing the orientation of the stencil as I go to get a bit of variation in my clouds. And this is just a very simple scene that I am creating. Once I'm happy with the clouds, I will remove my yellow piece of masking tape that's masking off the ground area, and I will swap it so it's covering up the sky instead. And then I'm going to add a hint of ink blending to my ground as well. I will switch and use milled lavender for this. Again, I'm using the Distress inks, not the Distress oxides, but you could use either. And I thought pink and purple works nicely on a Valentine's card, and it's also, I took inspiration from the colours on the current Lawn Fanatics challenge. I can include a link to that in the description box as well. Having completed all my ink blending, I will remove the masks from the image, and then I'm going to do my colouring. And I'm using Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers for my colouring. The caps are on screen so you can see which colours I have used. I decided to go with kind of more muted pinks for my colouring, so I'm using antique pinks. I will start by putting in my darkest colours in the shadow areas, and I almost always work that my shadows are on the left hand side as if my light source is coming from the top right. And I do prefer to work from darkest to lightest when I colour. There are some exceptions, but that's generally how I do it. I'm not an expert at colouring, and certainly not at no-line colouring. I haven't done it a lot, and I definitely struggle with it a little. I'm not sure why I decided to do it on this card, but I thought I would give it a go. My biggest issue was losing where the eyes were, and I did have to draw them back in afterwards, and I struggled with one of them in particular. So that's one thing to pay attention to, where all your little features on your image are. I also used two pale pinks or pastel pinks as my lighter shades because I only had the two shades of antique pink, and just used those to add in my highlights. And once I'm happy with how that looks, I will go back in with my darkest shade, the vintage pink, and I'm going to use that to draw the lines of the eyes back in. The one on the right was easy enough to do because I could more or less see the lines, but the one on the left I couldn't see it at all, and I did struggle with the shape a little. I also used that antique pink to add the mouth in, and I brought in a touch of flame red just to darken that up a bit more, blending it out again with the vintage pink. Having completed the colouring, I also decided to go in and add a little bit of shading under my little monster. I looked on my colour chart and compared the colours of the pens to the colours I had used, and I thought this old lavender colour worked well with that milled lavender that I'd used for my ground. So I just added a touch of that for my shadow and then blended it out with my blender pen. My card base is also made from Neenah Solar White. I used the £110 version for the card base, and I wanted to make sure that the focal heart would stand out nicely against it. So I decided to use my palest grey, which is Ice Grey 2, to add a border all around the heart. So I'm just very carefully drawing an edge all around the heart to kind of frame it off and just help it stand out against that white background once it's on the card base. Then I worked on adding my other elements to the card. I chose the sentiment that says "Sending you monster hugs," and I'm going to stamp that with Simon Says Stamp barely beige ink. I'll stamp it a couple of times because I do want it to show up properly, but this is the closest ink I had to a grey and I didn't want to use black for my stamping, so this is what I decided to go with. I think I stamped it 3 or 4 times to make sure it would be dark enough impression. One of the times my card base must have shifted slightly, so there is some very slight shadowing to the wording, but I'm just going to say it adds a bit of extra interest and pretend it was intentional. I don't think it looks too bad, and the recipient won't necessarily know that it wasn't intentional, so I'll just go with that. I also added another monster. I chose the winged monster from the stamp set this time, and I stamped it with the milled lavender distress ink because I'm going to be going with a purple monster this time. I did give him little grey wings using again my lightest greys, so I have Ice Grey 2 and Ice Grey 6, and I tried to give the look of dimension and folds in those wings. The lines don't disappear quite as well on this monster as they did on my first one, but they're still soft, so I think it works well enough. But if I was to do it again, I probably would have stamped this one with the barely beige ink instead. I also, learning from the difficulties I had on the first monster, I did go in and add my eyes and fill in the mouth with that ice grey, just to make sure I wouldn't lose those features when I added the other colours to the card and make sure I knew where they were all along. I'm going to again use the same old lavender, which is a dusky purple colour, for my darkest colour on my monster. This is the same colour I chose for the shading on my ground of my other monster, if you remember. And then I'll use DP1, which is Wisteria, as the lighter colour on this monster. And I did end up sticking with just the 2 shades because I didn't really have any other purples that would go with this, and I thought it worked well enough just with 2. I did go back in again with the darker of the 2 shades just to really intensify those shadows and make sure there was enough contrast on the image. I also went back in with that grey to darken up the eyes again, and then I brought in a touch of ivory to add some colour to the teeth. Then before adding my focal heart to the card, I decided I would add some more stamping, and I'm using the row of hearts from Simon Says Stamps Really Like You stamp set. This stamp isn't quite long enough to go all the way across the card, so I am going to have to move it and re-stamp it to make a full line across. But that's not difficult with the MISTI, it's pretty straightforward. I end up stamping 3 rows of the hearts. The first row I stamp is with the Spun Sugar Distress ink, and I stamp 2 or 3 times because Distress ink isn't really designed for stamping with, it's more for techniques, so it does have a tendency to pull up a bit, and stamping it a few times makes sure that it gets a decent coverage. Once I had that row done, I went in again, I moved the card up very slightly, and I'm going to stamp another row, this time using the milled lavender ink, and I'll just do the exact same thing, stamping a few times until I'm happy with the coverage of the ink. And finally I add a 3rd row, and I went back to the Spun Sugar ink for this. So I have alternating pink and purple rows of hearts. Then I need to add my focal panel, that little heart that I had ink blended and coloured, and I've got some foam tape on the back of that, and I will stick it up over those stamped hearts, using them as a guideline for my positioning. And as a final touch, I decided to embellish with some Nuvo drops, but where I would usually make drops with the Nuvo drops, I decided to use them to create little heart shapes. It's very straightforward, you just kind of draw a V and it makes a heart. The Nuvo drops I used are crystal drops in Wisteria purple. I thought the colour worked nicely with the other elements I had on the card, and so that's why I decided to go with those. Added a few different clusters, trying to keep them flowing with the design of the card, and also taking into consideration that using odd numbers looks most visually pleasing. So I used both of those things as a guideline as where to put them, and these drops take about 24 hours to fully dry. And that completes my no line colouring Valentine's card using stamps from Lawn Fawn. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget that it is part of a blog hop, and you can find a link to my blog post down below to find all the information on the hop. If you did enjoy this video, you can press the like button down below to let me know, and if you didn't, then the dislike button is right next to it. You can subscribe to see more of my videos by pressing the button on screen now if you're not already a subscriber, and if you press the notification bell below, then you will be notified every time I post a new video. If you'd like to see more videos from me immediately, there are a couple showing on screen that you might be interested in. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again in the next video. Bye!